Sometimes you lose everything so completely that you forget what hope feels like. That's exactly where Lila Jane Mercer found herself when she collapsed on the dusty streets of a forgotten Colorado cattle town. She had nothing left, no family, no home, no future she could imagine. Most folks stepped around her like she was invisible. But Ezekiel, Zeke Holt, wasn't most folks. This giant of a man, feared by everyone in town, lifted her up and carried her to safety. When she woke, she expected judgment or worse. Instead, he offered soup, shelter, and something she'd never known: true belonging. When the townspeople questioned his decision, he simply said, "She's mine now." For the first time in her life, someone was willing to fight for her. But when her dangerous past catches up, will their newfound bond survive the storm that's coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing Lila noticed when consciousness returned wasn't the unfamiliar ceiling or the scent of wood smoke, it was the absence of fear. For the first time in months, she'd awakened without that familiar clench in her stomach, the instant assessment of danger that had become second nature since she'd lost everything. She lay still on what felt like a real bed, not the hard ground or splintered boards she'd grown accustomed to. A heavy quilt covered her, handmade from the feel of it, worn soft with years of use. Through a small window, afternoon light filtered golden and warm, carrying the distant sounds of cattle lowing and men calling to each other in the easy rhythm of ranch work. Where was she? The memory came back in pieces, stumbling through Millbrook's main street, her vision blurring at the edges, her knees finally giving out in front of Harper's trading post. She remembered the gasps of townspeople, the way they'd stepped back as if poverty might be catching. Then strong arms lifting her, a deep voice saying something she couldn't quite make out, and darkness. The man who'd carried her, Ezekiel Holt. Even through her haze of exhaustion, she'd recognized him, every woman in town, whispered about the giant who lived alone on the ridge, who came to town only when necessary and spoke to no one unless spoken to first. They said he stood near 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could block out the sun and hands that could crush a man's skull without effort. They said he'd lost his family years ago and had never been right since. What they didn't say, what Lila was beginning to understand, was that beneath all that fearsome size lived a man with a gentle soul. The cabin around her spoke of careful hands and patient work. The walls were chinked tight against winter winds, the floor swept clean, the few pieces of furniture built to last generations. Everything had its place, from the rifle mounted above the door to the books lined neatly on a shelf she could see from the bed. This wasn't the home of a wild man. This was the refuge of someone who'd learned to find peace in solitude. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the air with the rich scent of beef and vegetables. Her stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it made her dizzy, but she forced herself to sit up slowly, testing her strength. The threadbare satchel that held her few remaining possessions sat on a chair nearby, exactly where she'd dropped it outside the trading post. He'd thought to bring it for her. Such a small kindness, yet it struck her as profound. In all her wandering, no one had cared enough to preserve even her meager belongings. The cabin door opened with a soft creak, and Ezekiel Holt stepped inside, ducking his head to clear the frame. In the daylight streaming through the windows, she could see him clearly for the first time. The townspeople were right about his size. He was massive, with broad shoulders that strained his worn shirt and hands that dwarfed the ceramic bowl he carried. But they'd missed the gentleness in his dark eyes, the careful way he moved, so as not to startle her. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow managed to be both commanding and soothing. "How do you feel?" Lila's throat felt raw, but she managed to whisper, "Better, thank you." He set the bowl on the small table beside the bed. Steam rose from what looked like the best soup she'd seen in months, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat that spoke of a man who knew how to care for himself. "Eat slow," he advised. "Been a while since you've had a proper meal, I'd guess." She wanted to ask why he'd helped her, why he'd brought her to his home when everyone else had walked past. Instead, she reached for the spoon with trembling fingers and took her first sip. The broth was rich and warming, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that tasted like comfort itself. "What's your name?" he asked, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. "Lila Jane Mercer," she said between careful spoonfuls. Then, because something about his quiet presence invited honesty, she added, "Though I haven't used it much lately. Been easier to be nobody." He nodded, as if he understood perfectly. "I'm Ezekiel Holt. Folks call me Zeke. I know who you are." The words came out before she could stop them, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, not offense, but a weary recognition. "I mean, people talk." "People always talk," he said mildly, "usually about things they don't understand." There was no bitterness in his voice, only acceptance. Lila found herself studying his face, looking for signs of the dangerous man the townspeople described. She saw strength, certainly, and a kind of careful control that spoke of someone who'd learned to manage his own power. But there was also sadness there, etched in the lines around his eyes, and a loneliness that called to something deep in her own heart. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. Zeke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. "My family," he said eventually. "Lost them 5 years ago. Raiders hit our place while I was in town. When I came back." He didn't finish the sentence, but she could see the pain and the tightness around his eyes. "Sarah, my wife, she would have helped you. Would have been the first one to your side. Maybe by helping you, I'm doing what she would have wanted." The simple honesty of it brought tears to Lila's eyes. She'd met men who'd helped her before, but their kindness had always come with expectations, with hands that wandered and suggestions that made her skin crawl. This man had saved her life and asked for nothing in return except the chance to honor his dead wife's memory. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "So am I," he said, "every day. But sorry doesn't change what is. We do what we can with what we have left." They sat in comfortable silence while she finished the soup, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them like a bridge. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, painting the cabin walls golden. This was the first time in months that Lila hadn't spent the approaching darkness calculating where she might sleep, whether she'd be safe, whether she'd wake up at all. "The townspeople," she said finally. "They won't understand this. A woman staying here." Zeke's expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Let me worry about the townspeople. You need rest and food and time to heal. That's what matters. But I can't stay here indefinitely. I have nothing to offer in return, no way to pay you back." "Did I ask you to pay me back?" The question was gentle but firm. "You're hurt and alone. In my book, that's reason enough." Lila set down the empty bowl, her hands steadier now. "You don't know anything about me. I could be running from the law, or worse. I could bring trouble to your door." "Could be," he agreed. "But you could also be exactly what you appear to be, woman who's had more than her share of hard luck and needs a safe place to land." He stood, towering over her, even seated as she was. "I've learned to trust my instincts about people. They're telling me you're not the kind of trouble I need to worry about. And if you're wrong?" For the first time, she saw a hint of something harder in his eyes, a glimpse of the man who'd survived alone on the frontier for 5 years. "Then I'll deal with it when the time comes. But I don't think I am." He moved to the stove, ladling soup into another bowl for himself. "You can stay as long as you need to. There's a spare room through that door, and I'll get you some proper clothes tomorrow. Mrs. Henderson at the general store will have something that fits. The whole town will know by morning." "The whole town already knows. Millbrook's not big enough for secrets." He settled back into his chair with his own meal. "Some will disapprove. Others will mind their own business. Either way, it doesn't change what's right." That night, Lila lay in the narrow bed in what had once been a child's room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Zeke moving quietly through the cabin. She could hear him banking the fire, checking the door, settling into what must be his own bed across the main room. Normal sounds, domestic and peaceful, that spoke of safety and routine. She thought about her family, her parents and younger brother, all taken by the fever 3 years ago, then the fire that had consumed their farm and everything they'd built. The months of drifting that had followed, trading her possessions one by one for food and shelter, until she'd had nothing left but the clothes on her back and the stubborn determination to keep moving. She'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care whether she lived or died. The warmth of it was almost overwhelming, this simple act of human kindness offered without condition or expectation. Tomorrow, she'd have to face the townspeople's stares and whispers. She'd have to figure out what came next, where she would go when Zeke's patience inevitably ran out. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. And in the morning, when she woke to the sound of Zeke starting the fire and preparing breakfast, she realized that sometime during the night, a small, tentative hope had taken root in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, she'd found somewhere she could belong. 3 weeks had passed since Lila had collapsed on Millbrook's dusty main street, and for the first time in years, she'd begun to understand what peace felt like. The rhythm of life at Zeke's cabin had become as natural as breathing waking to the sound of him starting the fire, sharing simple meals at the worn wooden table, spending her days helping with small tasks while he worked the cattle. She'd found the rocking chair on a Tuesday morning, sitting on the cabin's front porch like it had always belonged there. The wood was rough-hewn but carefully shaped, each piece fitted together with the patience of a man who understood that the best things took time. When she'd run her fingers along the smooth armrests, she could see the hours Zeke had spent in his workshop, carving and sanding by lamplight after his daily work was done. "You made this," she'd said when he returned from checking the fence line, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite name. Zeke had paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking almost embarrassed. "Seemed like you might enjoy sitting out here in the evenings. Gets real pretty when the sun sets behind the mountains." The simple generosity of it had nearly undone her. In all her years of wandering, no one had built her anything, made her a place to belong. The rocking chair wasn't just furniture, it was a statement, a quiet declaration that he expected her to stay long enough to use it. Now, as she sat in that same chair watching the afternoon light paint the valley gold, Lila felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: contentment. The threadbare satchel that held her few possessions rested beside her, but for the first time since she'd started carrying it, she wasn't mentally cataloguing its contents or planning her next move. She was simply present, in this moment, in this place that had begun to feel like home. That's when she saw the stranger. He sat his horse at the edge of town, a dark figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Even from a distance, something about his stillness set her nerves on edge. He wasn't moving through town like a traveler, he was studying it, taking its measure with the calculating gaze of a man who made his living from other people's secrets. Lila's hand moved instinctively to the wanted poster she'd kept hidden in the bottom of her satchel all these months. She'd found it nailed to a tree outside Pueblo, her father's face staring back at her from the faded paper. Dead or alive, it had read, though she knew with grim certainty that her father was beyond anyone's reach now. What worried her was the description underneath his picture. Known to travel with daughter, approximately 20 years of age, brown hair, maybe using assumed names. Her father had been many things: a dreamer, a gambler, a man who'd loved his family even as his weakness had destroyed them. But he'd never been an outlaw, not in the way that mattered. The debts he'd left behind, though those were real enough, and the men who'd come collecting after his death had made it clear that his debts were now hers to settle. The stranger dismounted in front of Harper's trading post, tying his horse with the economical movements of someone who'd done the same thing in 100 different towns. He was well dressed for a drifter, his coat clean and his boots polished, but there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of violence held in careful check. Lila forced herself to remain still in the rocking chair, to give no sign of the alarm bells ringing in her head. She'd learned long ago that running too early only drew attention. Better to wait, to see if this was really about her, or just the paranoia that had kept her alive these past months. But when the stranger emerged from the trading post, 20 minutes later, and began making his way methodically from building to building, stopping to speak with anyone who'd listen, she knew her peaceful interlude was over. Zeke found her there an hour later, still sitting in the chair but rigid with tension, her knuckles white where she gripped the armrests he'd carved for her. "What's wrong?" he asked, settling onto the porch steps with the easy grace of a big man who'd learned to move carefully in a world built for smaller people. "There's a stranger in town. Been asking questions. Lots of strangers pass through Millbrook. It's cattle season." "Not like this one." Lila forced herself to meet his eyes, seeing the calm intelligence there that had become such a source of comfort. "Zeke, there are things about my past I haven't told you. Things that might." "Then tell me now." The simple words, spoken without judgment or demand, broke something loose inside her chest. She'd been carrying the weight of her secrets for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone willing to share the burden. "My father wasn't just a farmer," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "He had gambling debts to some very dangerous men. When he died, they said those debts transferred to me. I've been running from them for almost a year." Zeke absorbed this information with the same steady calm he brought to everything else. "How much?" "More than I could earn in a lifetime. But it's not really about the money anymore. My father saw something, heard something he wasn't supposed to. These men, they don't just want payment, they want to make sure he never told anyone what he knew. And they think he told you." "I don't know what he knew. I was barely 16 when he started getting deep into trouble, and he kept me away from all of it. But they don't believe that." The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road made them both look up. The stranger was riding toward the cabin, his horse moving at an easy pace that somehow managed to feel threatening. In the fading light, Lila could see his face clearly for the first, time-lean and sharp-featured, with cold eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Mercer," he called out when he was still 20 yards away, confirming her worst fears. "I'd like a word with you." Zeke rose to his feet with fluid grace, positioning himself between Lila and the approaching rider. "You're on private property," he said, his voice carrying a note of warning that made the stranger pull up short. "Samuel Cray," the man said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "I represent certain business interests with a legitimate claim against Miss Mercer. I'd appreciate the chance to discuss the matter civilly. Then you can discuss it in town during business hours, with the sheriff present." Zeke replied, "This is my land, and the lady is under my protection." Cray's smile was thin and cold. "Your protection? That's interesting, Mr. Holt. I wonder what the good people of Millbrook would think about their local hermit harboring a fugitive." "I wonder what they'd think about a stranger threatening a woman on my porch," Zeke countered, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. For a moment, the two men stared at each other in silence, measuring and being measured. Then Cray's smile widened, though it never reached his eyes. "No threats here, just business. But business has a way of becoming everyone's concern when it's not handled promptly." He turned his attention back to Lila, who had stood but remained behind Zeke's protective bulk. "Your father's debts won't disappear just because you found yourself a guardian, Miss Mercer. Sooner or later, accounts must be settled." "My father's dead," Lila said, finding her voice at last. "Whatever he owed died with him." "Now that's where you're wrong," Cray said, reaching into his coat to withdraw a folded document. "Legal transfer of debt, properly witnessed and filed. Every penny he owed is now your responsibility, with interest, of course." He dropped the paper on the porch steps and wheeled his horse around. "I'll be in town for a few days, giving you time to consider your options. But don't take too long, Miss Mercer. My employers are not known for their patience." As his hoofbeats faded into the distance, Lila sank back into the rocking chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The peaceful haven she'd found here, the first real home she'd known since her family died it, was all about to be torn away. "Lila." Zeke's voice was gentle but firm. He picked up the document Cray had dropped and scanned its contents, his expression growing darker with each line. "This isn't legal. Debts don't transfer to children, not without specific agreements. Legal doesn't matter to men like Samuel Cray, she said bitterly. They make their own rules and enforce them with guns. Then we'll make some rules of our own. She looked up at him, seeing something in his face she'd never seen before, a hardness that reminded her why the townspeople whispered about him in fearful tones. Zeke, no. These aren't ordinary men. They've killed before, and they'll kill again. I won't have your blood on my hands. And I won't have you running scared for the rest of your life. He knelt beside her chair, his large hands gentle as they covered hers. You said your father saw something, heard something. What if we could figure out what that was? What if we could turn the tables on them? It's too dangerous. Living scared is dangerous too, he said quietly. I know something about that. After Sarah died, I spent 5 years hiding up here, convincing myself I was keeping safe, when really I was just dying slowly. You gave me a reason to live again, Lila. Don't ask me to watch you throw your life away without a fight. The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket. In the space of a few weeks, this quiet, gentle giant had become more important to her than her own safety. The thought of bringing danger to his door made her stomach clench with fear, but the thought of running again, of losing this fragile happiness they'd built together, felt like a kind of death. What are you suggesting? She asked. We find out what your father knew. We turn this from defense to offense. His eyes held hers steadily. And we make it clear to Mr. Cray and his employers that some things are worth fighting for. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook flickered to life one by one, a constellation of warmth against the gathering darkness. Somewhere in that town, Samuel Cray was settling in for the night, confident that fear would drive his prey into his hands. He didn't know about the rocking chair on the porch, or the man who'd built it with his own hands as a promise of permanence. He didn't understand that Lila Jane Mercer had finally found something worth protecting. As she sat in that chair, feeling the solid comfort of its embrace, Lila made a decision that would change everything. For the first time in her life, she wasn't going to run. She was going to fight. The decision to stay and fight looked different in the harsh light of dawn. Lila had spent the night staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through every possible scenario, most of them ending badly. By the time she heard Zeke moving around the main room, preparing coffee and stoking the fire, she'd nearly convinced herself to slip away before he woke. But then she smelled bacon frying and heard him actually humming an old tune under his breath, and she realized she couldn't do it. Couldn't leave without a word. Couldn't take the coward's way out when this man had offered her everything he had. She found him at the stove, his massive frame somehow managing to look domestic as he tended the pan. He glanced up when she appeared, taking in her rumpled dress and the dark circles under her eyes, with a single, perceptive look. Rough night? He asked, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. I thought about leaving, she admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The honest words hung between them, raw and unvarnished. I know. He turned back to the bacon, his voice calm. Figured you might. Can't say I'd blame you. But I didn't. No, he agreed, a hint of something that might have been relief coloring his tone. You didn't. They ate breakfast in contemplative silence, both of them aware that everything had changed with Samuel Cray's arrival. The easy peace of the past weeks was gone, replaced by the tense anticipation of conflict. But underneath the tension, Lila felt something else, determination she hadn't experienced since her father's death. I need to tell you everything, she said finally, setting down her fork. If we're going to do this, you deserve to know what we're up against. Zeke nodded, settling back in his chair with the patient attention of a man who understood the importance of the whole story. My father was James Mercer, she began. We had a small farm outside of Pueblo, nothing fancy, but enough to make a living. Papa was good with horses, and folks would bring their animals to him for training. We were happy, or as happy as anyone could be. She paused, remembering those golden days before everything went wrong. But Papa had a weakness. He loved cards, loved the excitement of the game. At first, It was just small stakes with neighbors, but then he started traveling to the bigger games in town. The losses mounted up faster than the wins. Zeke listened without judgment, his dark eyes steady and encouraging. The men he owed money to weren't the usual creditors. They were part of something bigger, land speculators who'd been buying up farms all through the valley. Papa said they weren't just interested in collecting debts, they wanted the land itself, wanted to drive farmers out so they could buy cheap and sell to the railroad. And your father found out something about their operation. He must have. Near the end, he was different, scared in a way I'd never seen before. He kept saying he should never have gotten involved, that he'd heard things no honest man should know. But he never told me what. Lila wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking warmth against the chill of memory. The fever took Mama and my brother first. Papa lasted another week, long enough to tell me to take what I could carry and run. He said if anyone came asking about him, I should deny everything, that I didn't know anything about his business. And you've been running ever since. For almost a year, I traded everything we owned just to stay ahead of them, but they're patient, they never stop looking. Zeke was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. These land speculators, they still operating around Pueblo. As far as I know, why? Because if they're still in business, that means they're still vulnerable. Whatever your father knew, it was important enough to kill for. That kind of secret doesn't lose its value just because time passes. The weight of his words settled over her. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as prey that she'd never considered the possibility of becoming the hunter. You really think we can turn this around? I think Samuel Cray wouldn't be here if his bosses felt secure. They're scared of something, and scared men make mistakes. A knock at the cabin door interrupted them. 3 quick raps followed by a pause, then 2 more. Zeke rose with fluid grace, his hand moving instinctively to his gun before he recognized the pattern. That's Doc Morrison, he said, relaxing slightly. Old cavalry signal. He opened the door to reveal a weathered man in his 60s, carrying a battered medical bag and wearing the cautious expression of someone bringing unwelcome news. Zeke, the doctor said, nodding to Lila. Miss, mind if I come in? Got some things we need to discuss. Of course, Doc. Coffee? Wouldn't say no. Morrison settled into a chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had seen too many frontier winters. Heard you had a visitor yesterday, man named Cray. Word travels fast, Zeke observed, pouring coffee. Faster when the visitor spends the evening buying drinks and asking questions about you and the young lady. Morrison's eyes found Lila. He's real interested in your background, miss. Real interested in why you're here and how long you're planning to stay. Lila felt her stomach tighten. What did people tell him? Nothing useful, mostly. Folks here are private by nature, and they respect Zeke. But there's always someone willing to talk if the price is right. Morrison accepted his coffee with a grateful nod. Thing is, this Cray fellow isn't just asking random questions. He knows specific things about your family, your father's debts. How specific? Zeke asked, his voice carefully neutral. Specific enough to make Sheriff Hawkins nervous. Cray showed him some papers, claimed he had legal authority to collect on a debt. Hawkins isn't sure what to make of it, but he's feeling pressure to at least investigate. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around Lila. She'd known this moment would come, but she'd hoped for more time. What does that mean? Means you might want to think about getting some legal help, Morrison said gently. Judge Cartwright retired to Denver, but he still knows his way around territorial law. If anyone can tell you where you stand legally, it's him. Zeke leaned forward, his expression intense. Doc, what do you know about land speculation around Pueblo? Companies buying up farms, maybe using pressure tactics? Morrison's eyebrows rose. Now that's an interesting question. Why do you ask? Because I think Miss Mercer's troubles might be connected to something bigger than gambling debts. The older man was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words. There've been rumors. Stories about farmers selling out for less than their land was worth, then mysterious fires or accidents happening to those who refused. Railroads been buying up right-of-way through there, paying top dollar for clear title. Clear title being the important part, Zeke said grimly. Exactly. Can't build through land tied up in legal disputes or unclear ownership. Morrison finished his coffee and stood. I'd be real careful if I were you two. Men with that kind of money don't like loose ends. After the doctor left, Lila and Zeke worked in silence, she mending a torn shirt while he cleaned his rifle with methodical precision. The domestic normalcy of their tasks contrasted sharply with the tension humming between them. We need supplies, Zeke said finally, and I want to send a telegram to Judge Cartwright. If we're going to fight this legally, we need to know what we're working with. That means going into town, facing the stares and whispers. It means not hiding anymore, he corrected gently. You're not a criminal, Lila. You're a woman trying to clear her family's name and build a life. There's no shame in that. When they reached the general store an hour later, Lila could feel the weight of curious eyes following their progress. She'd grown accustomed to the relative privacy of the cabin, and the sudden exposure felt overwhelming. But Zeke's steady presence beside her provided an anchor, his calm confidence reminding her that she had every right to be here. Mrs. Henderson behind the counter was professionally polite, but clearly bursting with curiosity. Mr. Holt, Miss Mercer, what can I help you with today? Need some supplies, Zeke said, producing a list, and I'd like to send a telegram if you don't mind. As Mrs. Henderson gathered their purchases, Lila became aware of other customers in the store, ranchers and townspeople who'd lived their entire lives in Millbrook. Some nodded politely, others pretended not to see her, but she could feel the undercurrent of speculation running through their quiet conversations. That's when she noticed the leather work gloves displayed near the counter, sturdy, well-made gloves that looked like they could handle anything ranch work might demand. On impulse, she pointed them out to Zeke. I want to help, she said quietly. With the ranch work, I mean. I can't keep being useless while you do everything. Zeke studied her face, seeing the determination there. Without a word, he picked up the gloves and added them to their purchases. These should fit, he said, his voice warm with approval. The simple transaction felt like a declaration to herself, to him, and to anyone watching. She wasn't just a charity case anymore. She was a partner, someone willing to work for her place here. As they left the store, Lila caught sight of Samuel Cray leaning against the hitching post across the street, watching their every move with calculating eyes. When he saw her looking, he touched his hat in a mockery of politeness and smiled a cold expression that sent chills down her spine. But for the first time since his arrival, she didn't look away. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, letting him see that she wasn't running anymore. The woman who'd collapsed from hunger and exhaustion 3 weeks ago was gone. In her place stood someone who'd found her strength in the quiet sanctuary of a giant's gentle heart. The fight was just beginning, but at least now she had weapons, legal knowledge, community support, and the unwavering loyalty of a man who'd proven that some things were worth defending. As they rode back to the cabin, the new gloves tucked safely in her pocket, Lila felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year: hope. The telegram from Judge Cartwright arrived 3 days later, delivered by a nervous young man from the telegraph office who seemed eager to complete his business and leave. Zeke read it twice before handing it to Lila, his expression grim. Debt, transfer documents, questionable. Stop. Need original papers and witness statements. Stop. Can meet next week if you come to Denver. Stop. Be careful. Stop. Lila set the telegram aside and reached for her mother's Bible, the one possession she'd managed to save from the fire that had claimed their farm. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and several pages were loose, but it remained the most precious thing she owned. She'd been carrying it in her threadbare satchel since she started running, taking comfort from its familiar weight. There's something I need to show you, she said, opening the Bible to the back pages where her mother had kept the family records. I've been afraid to look at this too closely, but after what Judge Cartwright said about witness statements, the pages contained the usual entries: births, deaths, marriages recorded in her mother's careful script. But tucked between the pages were pressed flowers from her parents' wedding bouquet, and behind the flowers, folded so small she'd almost missed it, was a piece of paper in her father's handwriting. What is it? Zeke asked, moving closer as she unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It's a list, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Names, dates, amounts of money. She scanned the entries, her heart pounding. Papa documented everything, every poker game, every debt, every payment. But look at this. She pointed to a series of entries near the bottom of the page, where her father's normally steady handwriting became increasingly erratic. These aren't gambling debts. These are payments made to him for information about other farmers' landholdings, their debts, their family situations. Zeke's jaw tightened as he read over her shoulder. Your father was feeding them intelligence about his neighbors. He was helping them target vulnerable families, Lila said, the weight of the revelation crushing. All those farmers who lost their land, Papa helped make it happen. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Everything she'd believed about her father's involvement in the land speculation scheme had been wrong. He hadn't been an innocent victim who'd stumbled onto something dangerous. He'd been a willing participant, trading his neighbors' futures for gambling money. That's why they want you, Zeke said finally. Not because he discovered their operation, but because he was part of it. You're the only one who can testify about what he did. And if I testify, I destroy his memory completely. But if I don't, she closed the Bible with shaking hands. They'll never stop hunting me. There might be another way. Zeke said carefully. If your father was working for them, then he wasn't the only one. There have to be other people involved, people who are still alive, still operating. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. This time it wasn't the familiar pattern of a friend, but the authoritative rap of someone who expected immediate compliance. Zeke moved to the window, peering out carefully before straightening with a curse. Sheriff Hawkins, and he's not alone. Lila felt her blood turn to ice. Through the window, she could see 3 men on horseback, the sheriff, Samuel Cray, and another man she didn't recognize wearing a deputy's badge that looked too new to be legitimate. Miss Mercer, Sheriff Hawkins called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. I need to speak with you about some legal matters. Please come out. Zeke's hand moved to his gun, but Lila caught his wrist. Don't. That's exactly what they want, an excuse to claim you're harboring a fugitive. I won't let them take you. They can't take me, not yet. The judge said those papers were questionable. She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steadfast presence. But we have to play this carefully. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, Zeke close behind her. Sheriff Hawkins dismounted, leaving Cray and his deputy on their horser positioning that spoke of preparation for a quick departure if things went badly. Afternoon, Sheriff, Zeke said, his voice neutral but carrying an undertone of warning. What can we do for you? It's Miss Mercer I need to speak with, Hawkins replied, though he kept his eyes on Zeke. The sheriff was a fair man, but he was also practical enough to know that challenging Ezekiel Holt on his own property was not a task to be undertaken lightly. Then speak, Lila said, stepping forward. I have nothing to hide. Mr. Cray here has presented some concerning documents regarding debts owed by your father. There's also been mention of missing property items that may have been stolen before your family's farm was destroyed. Lila felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was a new accusation, one designed to paint her not just as a debtor but as a thief. What missing property? Cray spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and reasonable. Your father had in his possession certain documents, maps, survey reports, correspondence that belonged to the Pueblo Valley Development Company. When our representatives went to collect these materials after his death, they were nowhere to be found. Because they burned in the fire, Lila said, but even as the words left her mouth, she realized the trap that had been laid. If the documents had burned, she couldn't prove their contents. If they hadn't burned, she was a thief for possessing them. That's convenient, the false deputy said with a sneer. Real convenient. Watch your tone, Zeke said quietly, but the words carried enough menace to make the man's hand move toward his gun. Easy, everyone, Sheriff Hawkins said, raising his hands. Miss Mercer, I'm going to need you to come to town with me, just to sort this out officially. She's not going anywhere, Zeke said, stepping protectively in front of Lila. Now, Zeke, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm trying to handle this by the book, but if you interfere with official business—" "What official business?" Lila asked, finding her voice. "Sheriff, have any formal charges been filed against me? Do you have a warrant?" Hawkins looked uncomfortable. "Well, no, but—" "Then I'm under no legal obligation to go anywhere with you," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "And unless Mr. Cray can produce properly witnessed documents and proof of these alleged stolen materials, his claims are nothing more than accusations." Cray's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Miss Mercer. My clients are not known for their patience with those who obstruct justice." "And I'm not known for my patience with men who threaten women on my property," Zeke said, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "I think it's time for you to leave." For a moment, the tension crackled between the two groups like lightning before a storm. Then Sheriff Hawkins remounted his horse, clearly relieved to have an excuse to withdraw. "Miss Mercer, you'd be wise to consider your position carefully," he said. "Sooner or later, these matters will have to be resolved officially." As the three men rode away, Lila sank down on the porch steps, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The confrontation had gone better than she'd feared, but it was clear that Cray was escalating his tactics. "They're not going to give up," she said, her voice hollow. "No," Zeke agreed, settling beside her. "But they're also not getting what they want. That makes them dangerous, but it also makes them desperate. What do you think really happened to those documents my father supposedly stole?" Zeke was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I think your father was smarter than they gave him credit for. If he was working for them, collecting information about his neighbors, he would have known how dangerous that knowledge was. Smart men keep insurance. You think he hid copies somewhere? I think a man who documented every gambling debt and payment in his family Bible was careful about other things too." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "Lila, when your farm burned, was everything destroyed?" "Everything in the house, but Papa had a workshop behind the barn." She trailed off, understanding dawning. "The workshop had a root cellar. Mama used to store preserves there in the summer. A root cellar that might survive a fire." The possibility hit her like a physical blow. All this time, she'd been running from ghosts, carrying the weight of debts that might not even be legally enforceable. But if her father had kept records, if he'd hidden evidence of the land speculation scheme, then she might have the power to bring down the very people who'd been hunting her. "We'd have to go back," she said. "Back to Pueblo, to the farm. It's dangerous. They'll be watching the place. Everything we're doing is dangerous." She looked at him, this gentle giant who'd become her anchor in the storm. "But if there's a chance to end this, to clear Papa's name, and stop them from hurting other families, then we take that chance," he finished. "But we do it smart. No rushing in, no taking unnecessary risks." That evening, as they sat on the porch in her rocking chair, she in the chair, he on the steps beside her, they planned their journey back to the place where her troubles had begun. The leather work gloves he'd bought her lay on the table beside them, ready for whatever work lay ahead. "Zeke," she said finally, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "When this is over, when we've settled accounts with these men, what then?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Then we build something new, something that can't be taken away by men like Cray." In the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered from across the valley. The sound was lonely but not hopeless a call, seeking connection in the vast wilderness. Sitting there with Zeke, holding the proof of her father's complicated legacy, Lila understood that she was no longer alone in the darkness. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey that would either free her from the past or destroy them both. But tonight, she was home. The journey to Pueblo took 3 days, traveling back roads and avoiding the main routes where Cray's associates might be watching. Lila rode beside Zeke in companionable silence, both of them alert to every sound and shadow, but neither willing to speak the fear that traveled with them like a third rider. On the second night, camped beside a stream that reflected the stars like scattered diamonds, Zeke surprised her by pulling something from his saddlebags, a small velvet pouch that looked older than either of them. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, his voice soft in the firelight. "Been in my family for 3 generations." He opened the pouch to reveal a silver locket, tarnished with age but beautifully crafted. The chain was delicate, clearly made for a woman's neck, and when he opened it, she could see a faded photograph of a young couple on their wedding day. "My grandparents," he explained, his thumb tracing the worn silver. "They came out here with nothing but hope and stubbornness. Built a life from scratch in a land that didn't want them." He looked up at her, firelight dancing in his dark eyes. "I sold this once, when times were hard after Sarah died. Took me 2 years to track it down and buy it back." The weight of what he was telling her settled slowly. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you should know." He closed the locket and held it out to her. "You should know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever we find at your father's place, you're not alone. And you should know that when we get through this, not if I want you to have this." Lila stared at the locket, understanding flooding through her like sunlight. This wasn't just a family heirloom, it was a promise, a declaration of intentions that went far beyond the immediate danger they faced. "Zeke," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't answer now," he said gently. "Just know that it's there, waiting for you when you're ready." The 3rd day brought them within sight of the Mercer farm, or what remained of it. Lila's breath caught as they crested the hill that overlooked the valley where she'd spent her childhood. The main house was gone, reduced to a blackened foundation choked with weeds. The barn had partially collapsed, its charred timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. But the workshop still stood. Built of stone and set back from the other buildings, it had survived the fire that had claimed everything else. The roof was damaged and one wall had partially collapsed, but the structure itself remained intact. "Wait here," Zeke said, dismounting and checking his rifle. "Let me make sure we're alone." Lila watched him move through the ruins with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to read danger in every shadow. His size, which might have been a disadvantage in other circumstances, somehow made him blend with the landscape, another large, permanent fixture in a world of stone and timber. 20 minutes later, he returned with the all clear. No signs of recent visitors. "Looks like they gave up watching this place months ago." They approached the workshop together, stepping carefully through debris and overgrowth. The door hung askew on broken hinges, and the interior was thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. But in the back corner, hidden beneath a pile of old tools and leather scraps, was the entrance to the Root Solara wooden trapdoor that had warped but remained intact. Zeke lifted the door, revealing rough stone steps that disappeared into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of preserved fruits and old wood. "I'll go first," he said, lighting a lantern he'd brought from his saddlebags. The cellar was small but well constructed, with stone walls and wooden shelving that had weathered the years admirably. Most of the preserves had long since spoiled, leaving behind only empty jars and stained wooden boards. But in the far corner, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked behind a loose stone, they found what they were looking for. "Papa's insurance," Lila breathed, unwrapping the package with trembling hands. Inside were documents, dozens of them, all in her father's careful handwriting. Maps showing property boundaries, lists of farmers and their financial situations, correspondence between various land speculators, and most damning of all, a detailed account of how the Pueblo Valley Development Company had been systematically targeting struggling farmers. "Look at this," Zeke said, holding up a letter written in an unfamiliar hand. "It's addressed to your father, but it's signed by someone named Marcus Thornfield. Ever heard that name?" Lila shook her head, scanning the letter's contents. It was a payment schedule, promising significant money in exchange for continued cooperation in property acquisition activities. But it was the letterhead that made her blood run cold. Thornfield and Associates, Denver legal consultants. "They have lawyers," she said, "professional lawyers helping them steal people's land." "More than that," Zeke said grimly, pointing to a notation at the bottom of the letter. Look at the address. That's not just any law firm, that's 3 blocks from the territorial courthouse. These people have connections at the highest levels. They spent another hour going through the documents, building a picture of corruption that reached far beyond simple land speculation. The Pueblo Valley Development Company was a front for a larger operation that involved territorial officials, railroad executives, and legal professionals working together to manipulate property laws for their own benefit. This is bigger than we thought, Lila said, sitting back on her heels. Papa wasn't just helping them target individual farmers, was documenting an entire conspiracy. And now we have the evidence to prove it. Zeke began carefully rewrapping the documents, but having the evidence and being able to use it safely are 2 different things. A sound from outside made them both freeze, the distant sound of horses approaching. Zeke extinguished the lantern immediately, plunging them into darkness. How many? Lila whispered. At least 3, maybe more. His voice was barely audible. They're being careful, trying not to make noise. They climbed quickly from the cellar, Zeke replacing the trapdoor and scattering debris over it to hide any sign of recent activity. Through a gap in the workshop wall, they could see riders moving through the ruins of the farmyard, searching methodically. Cray? Lila asked. No, these are different men, professional searchers, not debt collectors. The riders spent 20 minutes going through the ruins, paying particular attention to areas where something might have been hidden. When they finally departed, they did so with the frustrated movements of men who'd failed to find what they were looking for. They're still searching for the same documents we just found, Zeke said after the hoofbeats had faded, which means someone knows your father kept records. Someone who's getting desperate. They made their way back to their horses, the precious documents secured in Zeke's saddlebags. As they prepared to leave, Lila took one last look at the place where she'd grown up, the blackened ruins that had once been her home, the overgrown fields where her family had worked and laughed and dreamed of the future. I'm sorry, Papa, she whispered. I'm sorry for what you did, but I understand why you did it, and I'm going to make sure it means something. The ride back to Millbrook was tenser than their journey out, both of them aware that they now carried information that could destroy powerful men. But underneath the tension was something else, hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, they had the tools to fight back. As they made camp that second night, Lila found herself thinking about the silver locket tucked safely in Zeke's saddlebags. The promise it represented, the future it offered, a life beyond running and hiding, beyond the weight of her father's mistakes. Zeke, she said finally, as they sat beside their small fire. Yes? When this is over, when we've brought these men to justice and cleared Papa's name, ask me again. He looked at her across the dancing flames, understanding immediately what she meant. And what will your answer be? Ask me again, she repeated, but the warmth in her voice made her answer clear. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the plainsnot, the threat of immediate storm, but the promise of rain to come. Change was in the air, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lila Jane Mercer was ready to embrace it. They arrived back in Millbrook to find the town buzzing with tension. Even before they reached the main street, they could see clusters of people gathered in urgent conversation, their voices carrying undertones of worry and speculation. Something's happened, Zeke said, guiding his horse toward the sheriff's office. Sheriff Hawkins emerged before they could dismount, his face grim and his badge reflecting the afternoon sun like a warning signal. Zeke, Miss Mercer. Glad to see you back safe. What's the trouble, Sheriff? Zeke asked, though the careful way Hawkins looked around before speaking suggested the trouble was significant. Had some visitors while you were gone, federal marshals, asking questions about land fraud and missing persons. Seems there's been complaints filed in Denver about irregular property seizures in the Pueblo Valley. Lila felt her heart leap. Someone else is investigating the land company. More than that, Hawkins said, lowering his voice. Marshal Coleman told me they've been tracking suspicious activity across 3 territories. Your Mr. Cray and his associates are wanted for questioning in connection with several disappearances. The news hit like a thunderbolt. They weren't the only ones fighting this battle, Federal. Authorities were already building a case against the conspiracy they'd just uncovered evidence of. "Where's Cray now?" Zeke asked. "That's the problem. He left town yesterday, but not alone. Took 6 men with him, all armed, all asking questions about where you two might have gone." Hawkins met Lila's eyes directly. "Miss, I think it's time you told me everything you know about this situation." They spent the next hour in the sheriff's office, laying out the documents they'd recovered from her father's hiding place. Hawkins examined each paper carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "This is federal territory now," he said finally. "These documents need to get to Marshal Coleman as soon as possible. But that means getting them to Denver safely, and I suspect Mr. Cray isn't going to let that happen without a fight." "We can handle Cray," Zeke said quietly. "It's not just Cray anymore," Hawkins replied. "According to the Marshal, the Pueblo Valley Development Company has connections to some very powerful people who won't hesitate to use violence to protect their interests." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses filled the street outside. Hawkins moved to the window, peering through the blinds with the practiced caution of a man who'd survived 20 years of frontier law enforcement. "Speak of the devil," he muttered. "Cray's back, and he's brought friends." Lila joined him at the window, counting 8 riders moving down the main street in formation. Cray rode at their head, but the men flanking him looked nothing like the small-time debt collectors she'd expected. These were professional hired guns with the cold eyes and careful posture of men who killed for money. "They're not here to negotiate," she said. "No," Zeke agreed, checking his rifle. "They're here to end this permanently." The riders stopped in front of the sheriff's office, but they didn't dismount. Instead, Cray called out in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of the town. "Sheriff Hawkins, I have legal warrants for the arrest of Lila Jane Mercer on charges of theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Send her out, and there won't be any trouble." Hawkins stepped onto the porch, his hand resting on his gun. "Let's see those warrants, Cray." "I don't think that's necessary," Cray replied smoothly. "Miss Mercer knows what she's done. The only question is whether the good people of Millbrook want to harbor a fugitive." "The good people of Millbrook," a new voice called out, "can speak for themselves." Lila's breath caught as she recognized Doc Morrison stepping into the street, followed by Mrs. Henderson from the general store, then the blacksmith, the preacher, and a growing crowd of townspeople. They arranged themselves in a loose line facing Cray's men, not threatening but clearly united. "This is our town," Morrison said calmly, "and Miss Mercer is under our protection." "Old man," one of Cray's hired guns snarled, "you're interfering with legal business." "And you're threatening our neighbors," the blacksmith replied, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "That doesn't sit well with us." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 8 professional killers faced down a crowd of shopkeepers and ranchers, but the resolve in the townspeople's faces was unmistakable. These weren't fighters, but they were defending their own. "Enough," Cray said finally. "Miss Mercer, I'm offering you one last chance to come quietly. Refuse, and the consequences will be on your head." Lila stepped onto the porch, feeling Zeke's presence solid and reassuring behind her. "Mr. Cray," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "I have something that belongs to you." She pulled out one of the letters they'd found in her father's hiding place, holding it high enough for everyone to see. "This is a letter from Marcus Thornfield, promising payment for property acquisition activities. Should I read it aloud, or would you prefer to conduct your business somewhere more private?" Cray's face went white, then red with rage. "That document is stolen property." "This document is evidence of criminal conspiracy," Sheriff Hawkins said, stepping forward, "and it's staying in my custody until the federal marshals can examine it." "You're making a serious mistake, Sheriff," Cray said, his voice low and dangerous. "The only mistake," a new voice called out, "would be letting you intimidate these good people any further." Everyone turned to see a tall man in a dark coat riding into town, a federal marshal's badge glinting on his chest. Behind him came 2 deputies, their rifles held ready but not quite aimed. "Marshal Coleman," Sheriff Hawkins said with obvious relief. "Good timing." "Mr. Cray," the marshal said pleasantly, "I believe you've been avoiding my questions. Perhaps now would be a good time to have that conversation." The standoff dissolved like smoke in the wind. Faced with federal authority and an angry crowd of citizens, Cray's hired guns seemed to lose their appetite for violence. One by one, they began backing their horses away from the confrontation. "This isn't over," Cray told Lila, his voice carrying across the space between them. "You have no idea how deep this goes, or how many people you're going to hurt when the truth comes out." "The truth is all I've ever wanted," she replied, "whatever it costs." As Cray and his men rode out of town, the crowd of townspeople gradually dispersed, each person stopping to offer Lila words of support or encouragement. Mrs. Henderson pressed a bag of supplies into her hands. Doc Morrison reminded her that she was always welcome at his table. The preacher spoke quietly of justice and redemption, but it was what happened later that evening that truly showed her how much her life had changed. Zeke led her up a hillside path she'd never explored before, to a place where wildflowers grew among weathered headstones. In the fading light, she could see 3 graves marked with simple wooden crosses. "Sarah," he said softly, kneeling beside the center grave, "and our 2 children, Emma and James." Lila knelt beside him, finally understanding the depth of loss that had driven him to his solitary existence. How old were they? Emma was 5, James was barely walking. His voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "The raiders took everything I loved in this world. For 5 years I thought I was done loving anything." He turned to look at her, his hand finding hers among the wildflowers. "You changed that. You gave me a reason to care about tomorrow again. Zeke, I need you to know," he continued, "that whatever comes next, whatever we have to face, you've already given me more than I ever thought I'd have again. You've given me hope." The wooden cross he'd carved for his family's grave was simple but beautifully made, worn smooth by weather and time. Seeing it, understanding the grief and love that had gone into its creation, Lila felt something shift inside her chest, the last of her defenses crumbling in the face of his absolute honesty. "I love you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid to hope for that kind of happiness again. But I love you." His kiss was gentle and reverent, flavored with wildflowers and the promise of forever. When they finally broke apart, the stars were coming out overhead, and the town of Millbrook sparkled with lamplight in the valley below. "Marshal Coleman wants to take the documents to Denver tomorrow," Zeke said, "to build the federal case against Thornfield and his associates. Which means testifying, facing questions about Papa's involvement. It means telling the truth, all of it, even the parts that hurt." He helped her to her feet, his hands warm and strong. "But you won't be facing it alone." As they walked back down the hillside, Lila realized that somewhere in the past weeks, she'd stopped being a woman running from her past and become someone ready to face whatever the future might bring. The silver locket waited in Zeke's cabin, a promise of permanence in a world that had taught her to expect nothing but loss. But tomorrow, when she stood before federal authorities and told the truth about her father's complicated legacy, she would do so as a woman who'd finally found her place in the world. A woman who'd discovered that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in running from the past, but in standing still long enough to build a future worth defending. The fight wasn't over. Men like Cray and Thornfield didn't surrender easily. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Lila Jane Mercer felt like she was going to win. The morning sun was barely touching the eastern peaks when Marshal Coleman knocked on the cabin door, his expression urgent in a way that immediately set Lila's nerves on edge. She'd been awake for hours anyway, reading her mother's Bible by lamplight and trying to find comfort in the familiar passages, when the sound of approaching horses shattered the pre-dawn quiet. "Miss Mercer, Mr. Holt," the marshal said without preamble. "We need to talk. There's been a development." They gathered around the kitchen table, the precious documents spread between them like pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to make sense. but the expression on Coleman's face suggested the picture they were revealing was far more complex than anyone had imagined. "I sent a telegram to my superiors in Denver last night," Coleman began. "Told them about the evidence you'd found, asked for background on Marcus Thornfield and the Pueblo Valley Development Company." "And?" Zeke prompted when the marshal paused. "Marcus Thornfield has been dead for 6 months." The words hit Lila like a physical blow. She stared at the letter bearing Thornfield's signature, the payment schedule that had seemed so incriminating just hours before. "That's impossible. This letter is dated 3 weeks ago, which means someone has been using his name and legal credentials to continue the land fraud operation." Coleman leaned forward, his voice grim. "Someone with access to his files, his letterhead, and detailed knowledge of his business practices." "A partner," Zeke suggested. "More than that," Coleman said. "Someone who was close enough to Thornfield to know every detail of the conspiracy, including which farmers your father was reporting on." Lila felt the world shifting beneath her feet. "You think someone killed Thornfield to take over his operation?" "I think Marcus Thornfield discovered that his partner was planning to eliminate him and tried to get out. According to the Denver authorities, he'd been asking questions about federal witness protection in the weeks before his death. The implications crashed over her like a cold wave. If Thornfield had been murdered by his own partner, then the conspiracy was far more dangerous than they'd realized. They weren't dealing with simple land speculators, they were facing someone willing to kill to protect their interests." "Who was Thornfield's partner?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. Coleman reached into his coat and withdrew a telegram, unfolding it carefully. "That's where things get complicated. Thornfield's law firm had 3 partners, but the Denver office has been closed since his death. His files were supposedly transferred to a holding company for safekeeping." "Let me guess," Zeke said dryly. "The holding company is connected to the Pueblo Valley Development Company." "Worse than that," Coleman replied. "The holding company is owned by Colorado Territorial Land Management, company with contracts to survey and acquire right-of-way for the railroad expansion." Lila stared at him, the full scope of the conspiracy finally becoming clear. The railroad isn't just buying land from the development company, they are the development company. Which explains how they've been able to manipulate territorial land laws so effectively, Coleman said. "They're writing the laws and enforcing them." But even as the larger picture came into focus, one piece still didn't fit. Lila pulled her mother's Bible closer, opening it to the back pages where she'd hidden her father's list. As she scanned the familiar entries, looking for something she might have missed, her finger stopped on an entry near the bottom of the page. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is it?" Zeke asked, moving to look over her shoulder. Lila pointed to a line written in her father's increasingly erratic handwriting. "Payment received from S. Cray, 50. Information regarding Henderson property boundaries." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel Cray, the man who'd been hunting her for months, claiming to represent her father's creditors, had actually been paying her father for information. "Cray wasn't collecting a debt," she said, her voice hollow with realization. "He was my father's handler, his contact with the land company." "Which means," Coleman said slowly, "that everything he's told you about your father's debts has been a lie." "But why?" Lila asked, though even as she spoke the words, understanding was dawning. "Why continue the charade after Papa died?" "Because your father kept records," Zeke said grimly. "And Cray knew it. He's been trying to get close to you, to gain your trust, so you'd lead him to the evidence." "The debt collection story was just a cover," Coleman added. "A way to justify following you, pressuring you, staying close until you revealed where your father had hidden his insurance policy." Lila felt sick as she remembered all the conversations she'd had with Cray, all the times she'd been tempted to trust him when he'd seemed sympathetic to her situation. He'd been playing a long game, manipulating her fear and desperation to serve his own ends. "There's more," Coleman said, pulling out another telegram. "The real Samuel Cray, man whose identity your pursuer has been using, died in a railroad accident 2 years ago. Whoever's been hunting you has been using a dead man's name." Then who is he really? Zeke asked. Based on the description you've given me and cross-referencing with territorial records, I believe he's actually Thomas Brennan Marcus Thornfield's former law partner and the real power behind the land speculation scheme. The name meant nothing to Lila, but the implications were staggering. The man who'd been terrorizing her for months, claiming to represent her father's creditors, was actually the mastermind of the entire conspiracy. He'd killed his own partner, stolen a dead man's identity, and spent months hunting her not for money, but to silence the only witness who could connect him to his crimes. He killed Papa, she said, the certainty settling over her like a shroud. Papa found out what Brennan was really doing, tried to get out, and Brennan killed him. Probably made it look like an accident, Coleman agreed, just like Thornfield's death. But when he couldn't find the documents after the fire, he realized your father must have told you where they were hidden. Except Papa never told me anything, Lila said bitterly. I've been running from a murderer who thought I knew secrets I never possessed. Until now, Zeke pointed out. Now you have the evidence to bring him down. But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching riders filled the morning air. Through the cabin window, they could see a large group of men moving up the valley road, too many to be a coincidence, moving too purposefully to be anything but trouble. Brennan, Coleman said, checking his rifle. He must have realized we're closing in. How many? Zeke asked, moving to the other window. 12, maybe 15, all armed. Coleman's expression was grim. He's not taking any chances this time. Lila clutched her mother's Bible to her chest, feeling the weight of her father's hidden letter pressed between its pages. The evidence that could bring down the entire conspiracy was here in this cabin, but it would be worthless if they didn't survive to present it to a federal court. There's something else, she said suddenly, remembering a detail from her father's letter that she'd overlooked in all the excitement of discovery. Papa wrote that he gave copies of some documents to Judge Cartwright before he retired to Denver. Coleman looked up sharply. Judge Cartwright has evidence? According to Papa's letter, he suspected something might happen to him. He wanted to make sure the truth would come out, even if he didn't survive to tell it. Then we need to get word to Denver, Coleman said. Let them know that Cartwright has corroborating evidence. But the approaching riders were close enough now that they could hear individual voices, see the glint of weapons in the morning sun. Whatever message they needed to send to Denver would have to wait until they survived the next hour. Miss Mercer, Coleman said formally, I'm placing you in federal protective custody. Whatever happens here today, that evidence needs to reach Denver. We're not running, Zeke said firmly. Not anymore. I'm not asking you to run, Coleman replied. I'm asking you to be smart. If Brennan gets his hands on those documents, a lot of innocent people are going to suffer. People like the families your father documented, the ones who lost their farms to this conspiracy. Lila looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the rocking chair Zeke had built for her, at the man who'd given her back her faith in the possibility of happiness. Then she looked at her mother's Bible, at the evidence of her father's complicated legacy hidden within its pages. I'm tired of running, she said finally, but I'm also tired of letting innocent people pay for crimes they didn't commit. She met Zeke's eyes, seeing understanding there. We end this here, today, whatever it takes. As the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, Lila Jane Mercer prepared to face the man who'd murdered her father and stolen a dead man's name. The scared, desperate woman who'd collapsed from hunger in Millbrook's Main Street was gone. In her place stood someone who'd learned that the greatest courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The final confrontation was coming, and she was ready. Marshal Coleman moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd faced desperate situations before, quickly assessing their defensive options while the sound of approaching riders grew steadily louder. The cabin's position on the ridge provided good visibility, but limited escape route exactly, the kind of tactical situation that could either save them or doom them, depending on how well they used their advantages. Mr. Holt, Coleman said, pinning a deputy's badge to Zeke's shirt with quick, decisive movements. I'm temporarily deputizing you to assist in federal law enforcement activities. You have full authority to act in defense of a federal witness. The badge felt heavy in Zeke's hands, weighted with responsibility and the memory of other men who'd worn similar symbols of justice. What do you need me to do? Help me keep Miss Mercer alive long enough to get that evidence to Denver. Coleman checked his rifle, his movements economical and precise. Brennan knows we have the documents now. He's not going to let us leave here alive if he can help it. Lila moved to the window, counting the riders as they spread out along the valley floor. 15 men, all armed, positioning themselves with the careful precision of soldiers rather than the casual aggression of common criminals. Brennan had brought professionals for this final confrontation. They're surrounding the cabin, she reported, her voice steadier than she felt. But they're staying out of rifle range. Smart, Zeke said grimly. Brennan's not taking any chances this time. Which means he's planning something more than a direct assault, Coleman added. He needs those documents intact, so he can't just burn us out. As if summoned by their conversation, a white flag appeared at the edge of the clearing, a piece of cloth tied to a rifle barrel, held high by a rider who approached slowly and deliberately. Even at a distance, Lila recognized the figure of the man she'd known as Samuel Cray, now revealed as Thomas Brennan, the mastermind behind months of terror and deception. Miss Mercer. Brennan called out when he was close enough for conversation, but still well beyond rifle range. I think it's time we had an honest discussion about what your father really left behind. I think we're done talking, Lila called back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation, Brennan replied, his tone reasonable but carrying undertones of threat. You're harboring evidence of federal crimes. That makes you an accessory after the fact. The only federal crimes here are yours, Marshal Coleman said, stepping onto the porch with his badge clearly visible. Thomas Brennan, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Marcus Thornfield. Brennan's mask of reasonableness slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Marshal Coleman, I was wondering when the federal government would take an interest in local land disputes. Local land disputes that involve forged documents, stolen identities, and multiple homicides tend to attract federal attention. Coleman replied, Drop your weapons and surrender. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Am I? Brennan asked, and gestured to his men positioned around the valley. I count 15 against 3. And I have information you might find interesting about Miss Mercer's father, information that might change your perspective on who the real criminals are here. Lila felt a chill of foreboding. Even now, facing arrest and certain conviction, Brennan was still playing games, still trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage. James Mercer wasn't just providing information about his neighbor's land holdings. Brennan continued, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He was actively participating in intimidation tactics, burning barns, poisoning wells, threatening families who refused to sell. That's a lie, Lila said, but even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept in. How well had she really known her father? How much of his business had he kept hidden from his family? Is it? Brennan asked. Why don't you ask your marshal friend to check the federal records for complaints filed against James Mercer? I think you'll find the picture isn't as clear as you've been assuming. Coleman's expression remained neutral, but Lila could see him processing this new information. Even if that were true, he said finally, it doesn't change the fact that you've been using a false identity and operating a criminal conspiracy. Criminal conspiracy? Brennan laughed, the sound carrying no warmth. Marshal, I think you'll find that everything my organization has done falls well within territorial law. We've purchased land through legitimate channels, using properly filed documents and legal procedures. Forged documents, Lila said, anger overriding her doubt. Stolen identities, murdered witnesses. Allegations, Brennan replied smoothly. And even if you could prove such things, consider what revealing the truth would mean for the families involved. Your father's activities implicated dozens of innocent people farmers who were forced to cooperate with him or face the consequences. The manipulation was skillful, designed to exploit Lila's guilt and compassion. But as she listened to Brennan's calculated words, she felt something crystallize inside her, not doubt, but clarity. Whatever her father had done, whatever crimes he might have committed, using that as justification for continued corruption was exactly the kind of moral cowardice that had allowed this conspiracy to flourish. "You're right about one thing," she said, stepping forward on the porch. "Papa did terrible things. He helped you steal from his neighbors, and maybe worse. But that doesn't make what you've done right. It makes it worse." "Miss Mercer," Brennan began. "I'm not finished," she interrupted, feeling the power of finally speaking truth after months of running from it. "You want to talk about federal crimes? Let's talk about the families you've destroyed, the homes you've stolen, the lives you've ruined. Let's talk about Marcus Thornfield, who tried to get out and ended up dead for his conscience. You can't prove." "I can prove everything," Lila said, pulling her mother's Bible from her coat. "Papa kept records of all of it, every payment, every threat, every family you targeted. And he kept copies with Judge Cartwright in Denver, insurance in case something happened to him." For the first time since the confrontation began, Brennan's composure cracked. "That's impossible. We searched Cartwright's files when he retired." "You searched his official files," Coleman said, understanding immediately. "But judges have been known to keep private records of cases that trouble their conscience." The admission had been a mistake, and Brennan knew it. His calm mask fell away completely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. "It doesn't matter what evidence you think you have. You're not leaving this valley alive to present it." "Actually," a new voice called from the tree line, "I think they are." Everyone turned to see Sheriff Hawkins emerging from the woods, leading a group of armed townspeople. Doc Morrison was there, along with the blacksmith, Mrs. Henderson, and at least a dozen other citizens of Millbrook. They moved, with the determined purpose of people defending their own. "How did you?" Brennan started. "Small towns have their ways of communicating," Hawkins said. "When federal marshals and hired guns start shooting at our neighbors, word gets around pretty fast." "This is a federal matter," Brennan protested. "You have no authority here." "I have all the authority I need," Hawkins replied, patting the rifle in his hands. "It's called the right to defend innocent people from murderers and thieves." The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. Brennan's men found themselves caught between the cabin and an armed group of citizens, their numerical advantage neutralized by the townspeople's superior position and knowledge of the terrain. "You're making a serious mistake," Brennan said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I have powerful allies, people who won't stand for this kind of interference." "Your allies," Coleman said, producing a telegram from his pocket, "are currently being arrested in Denver. The federal investigation you thought you'd avoided has been proceeding for months. We've been building a case against the entire railroad land fraud operation." The telegram bore the official seal of the U.S. Marshals Service, and as Coleman read its contents aloud, the scope of the federal investigation became clear. Arrests had been made at the highest levels of territorial government. Bank accounts had been frozen. Properties had been seized as evidence. "The Colorado Territorial Land Management Company is finished," Coleman continued, "along with everyone associated with it." Brennan's men began looking around nervously, clearly realizing that their employer's promises of protection had evaporated. Several of them began backing away from their positions, unwilling to fight a battle for a lost cause. "Stand your ground," Brennan ordered, but his voice carried the desperation of a man watching his empire crumble. "I don't think so," one of the hired guns said, holstering his weapon. "I signed on to collect a debt, not fight federal marshals and half the territory." One by one, Brennan's men began withdrawing, until only 3 remained the true believers or those too deeply implicated to hope for mercy. The overwhelming force that had seemed so threatening just minutes before had melted away like snow in spring sunshine. But Brennan himself showed no signs of surrender. If anything, the desertion of his men seemed to harden his resolve. He drew his pistol with the fluid motion of a man who'd used violence to solve problems before. "If I can't have those documents," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing with chilling finality. "Then nobody can." The standoff crystallized in that moment, a desperate man with nothing left to lose, facing people who'd found something worth dying for. Lila clutched her mother's Bible closer, feeling the weight of her father's hidden letter pressed between its pages. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd suffered to achieve, came down to this single moment of confrontation. "Brennan!" Coleman called out, his rifle trained on the man who'd terrorized Lila for so long. "You're outnumbered 20-4. This is your last chance to surrender." "Some things are worth more than survival, Marshal," Brennan replied, "and some secrets are too dangerous to let live." As he raised his pistol toward the cabin, toward Lila, and the evidence that could bring down an entire network of corruption, the morning air seemed to hold its breath. The final moments of Thomas Brennan's criminal empire were about to be written in gunpowder and determination. The battle for justice was about to begin. The first shot shattered the morning stillness like breaking glass, Brennan's bullet splintering the doorframe inches from where Lila stood. She dove for cover behind the heavy wooden table as chaos erupted around her, the careful standoff dissolving into deadly violence. Zeke's return fire came immediately, his rifle speaking with the authority of a man who'd learned to shoot before he'd learned to shave. One of Brennan's remaining men spun and fell, his own weapon discharging harmlessly into the air as he collapsed. "Stay down!" Coleman shouted over the gunfire, positioning himself at the window with the practiced efficiency of a veteran lawman. "Don't give them a clear target." But even as bullets flew and men shouted orders, Lila's attention was drawn to her father's pocket watch, lying forgotten on the table where she'd placed it while examining the documents. The watch that had belonged to her grandfather, passed down through generations of Mercers, somehow overlooked in all their discoveries about her father's hidden papers. With trembling fingers, she opened the watch's outer case, revealing not just the familiar timepiece, but a hidden compartment she'd never known existed. Inside, pressed flat against the inner lid, was a single piece of paper document that made her blood run cold as she read its contents. "Zeke," she called out, her voice cutting through the gunfire. "I found something, the final piece." The paper was a confession, written in her father's hand, but dated just days before his death. In it, he detailed not just his own crimes, but the entire structure of Brennan's operation names, dates, methods, and most damning of all, a list of territorial officials who'd been taking bribes to look the other way. "What is it?" Zeke asked, reloading his rifle while keeping watch on Brennan's position. "Papa's final insurance policy," she replied, scanning the devastating document. "He didn't just keep records of the land fraud, he documented the corruption that made it possible." The confession named 3 territorial judges, 2 federal land commissioners, and a railroad executive who'd been coordinating the entire scheme from Denver. It was the kind of evidence that could bring down governments and send powerful men to federal prison. "That's why Brennan's so desperate," Coleman said, understanding immediately. "It's not just about covering up his crime sits, about protecting his co-conspirators at the highest levels." Another volley of gunfire forced them to take cover again, but Lila could see that the battle was turning in their favor. Sheriff Hawkins and the townspeople had positioned themselves expertly, using their knowledge of the terrain to outflank Brennan's remaining men. The blacksmith's booming voice could be heard directing the citizens' fire, while Doc Morrison's steady rifle spoke from a position that commanded the entire valley approach. But Brennan himself remained dangerous, moving with the desperate cunning of a cornered predator. He'd taken shelter behind a fallen log that provided excellent cover, while giving him a clear field of fire toward the cabin. "Miss Mercer," he called out during a lull in the shooting, "I know you found something in that watch. Your father was always too clever for his own good." "Clever enough to document your entire operation," she called back, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Clever enough to get himself killed when he developed a conscience," Brennan replied, "just like you're about to be." But as he raised his rifle to take aim at the cabin window, Zeke was already moving. The big man flowed across the room with surprising grace, positioning himself directly between Brennan's gun and Lila's position. "Not happening," he said simply. and the quiet determination in his voice carried more authority than any shouted threat. "Touching," Brennan sneered, "the gentle giant protecting his lost lamb. But bullets don't care about good intentions." "Neither do federal marshals," Coleman said, and Lila realized that while Brennan had been focused on his confrontation with Zeke, the marshal had been quietly working his way around to a flanking position. The final moments of the battle unfolded with the terrible clarity of a photograph. Brennan, realizing his tactical situation had collapsed, made one last desperate gambit not to escape, but to destroy the evidence that could convict his powerful associates. He pulled a stick of dynamite from his coat, the fuse already lit and sparking. "If I can't have those documents," he shouted, "then they burn with all of us." Time seemed to slow as the deadly cylinder arced through the air toward the cabin. Lila watched its tumbling progress with the detached fascination of someone witnessing their own doom, the lit fuse trailing sparks like a falling star. But Zeke was already moving, his massive frame launching toward the smoking explosive with the desperate speed of a man who'd found something worth dying for. His hands closed around the dynamite, just as it would have crashed through the cabin window, and with a movement that seemed almost casual, he hurled it back toward the trees, where it could harm no one. The explosion, when it came, shook the entire valley. Trees splintered and earth flew, but the cabin and its precious contents remained intact. In the ringing silence that followed, Brennan's voice could be heard one last timino in defiance or threat, but in the broken acknowledgement of complete defeat. "Damn you all," he whispered, then raised his hands in surrender. The battle was over, but the war for justice was just beginning. As Marshal Coleman placed Thomas Brennan under arrest and Sheriff Hawkins secured the remaining hired guns, Lila sat in her rocking chair on the cabin porch, holding her father's pocket watch and feeling the weight of all the truth it contained. The confession hidden in the watch would send shockwaves through the territorial government. Powerful men would fall, stolen lands would be returned to their rightful owners, and families destroyed by Brennan's conspiracy would finally see justice. But more than that, she'd finally learned the complete truth about her father, not just his crimes, but his final attempt at redemption. He'd died trying to make amends for the harm he'd caused, leaving behind evidence that would protect the very people he'd helped victimize. "It's over," Zeke said, settling onto the porch steps beside her. "No," she replied, opening the watch to look at the confession one more time. "It's just beginning." The chaos in the aftermath of Brennan's arrest was controlled but intense, with Marshal Coleman coordinating the securing of evidence while Sheriff Hawkins managed the prisoners and townspeople. But through it all, Lila felt a strange sense of calm settling over her, as if the resolution of the immediate crisis had created space for something larger to emerge. She was still sitting in the rocking chair, her father's pocket watch in her hands, when Zeke approached with something cupped in his palm. The silver ring caught the morning sunlight, transforming it into sparks of promise and hope. "Lila," he said, his voice carrying all the gentle strength that had first drawn her to him. "I know this isn't the most romantic setting, with federal prisoners and evidence of conspiracy scattered around us, but I can't wait another moment to ask you properly." He knelt before the rocking chair he'd built for her, the ring his mother's ring held between them, like a bridge, spanning the distance between what had been and what could be. Around them, the business of justice continued, but their world had narrowed to this single, perfect moment. "You've given me back my life," he continued, his dark eyes holding hers with absolute sincerity. "You've reminded me that love doesn't end when loss comes, it just changes shape, becomes something deeper and more precious, because we understand how fragile it is." Lila felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. After months of running, years of loss, she'd found not just safety, but belonging, not just shelter, but home. "Ezekiel Holt," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you in the middle of a federal crime scene?" "I'm asking you to marry me wherever you'll have me," he replied, "though I admit the timing could be better." "The timing," she said, reaching out to cup his face in her hands, "is perfect. We've been through fire together, literally and figuratively. If we can survive Thomas Brennan and a dynamite explosion, I think we can handle marriage. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," she said, and leaned down to kiss him as he slipped the ring onto her finger. The kiss was interrupted by the sound of applause, tentative at first, then growing stronger as the townspeople and even Marshal Coleman took a moment to celebrate something beautiful, emerging from the ugliness of the morning's events. "About time," Doc Morrison called out with a grin. "Some of us have been waiting weeks for you two to figure out what was obvious to everyone else." But the celebration was brief, interrupted by the arrival of another rider, this one, wearing a federal courier's uniform and carrying dispatches that would determine the next phase of their fight for justice. "Marshal Coleman," the courier said, dismounting quickly. "Priority messages from Denver and Washington." Coleman read the dispatches with growing satisfaction, then looked up at the assembled group with something approaching a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have good news. The federal investigation has been even more successful than we hoped." He held up the first telegram. 17 arrests have been made in Denver, including 2 territorial judges and the entire board of Colorado Territorial Land Management. The railroad's illegal land acquisition operation has been completely shut down. The second dispatch brought even better news. Judge Cartwright's private files contained enough evidence to prosecute not just the local conspirators, but their connections in Washington. The federal land fraud investigation is now expanding to include operations in 4 territories. "What does that mean for the families who lost their farms?" Lila asked, thinking of all the people her father had helped victimize. "Full restitution," Coleman replied. "The government is seizing all assets acquired through the fraudulent land sales and returning them to their rightful owners. Your father's confession and records will be key evidence in making sure every family gets justice." As the magnitude of their victory became clear, Lila felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the deep satisfaction of seeing justice truly served. The conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives was crumbling, its architects facing federal prosecution, its victims finally receiving compensation for their losses. But the most important victory was personal. Looking at the ring on her finger, feeling Zeke's solid presence beside her, she realized that she'd found something Thomas Brennan and his associates could never understand: the power of love to transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. "There'll be trials," Coleman warned. "Testimony required from both of you. The federal prosecutors will want to present the complete picture of the conspiracy." "We'll be there," Lila said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes to make sure this never happens to another family." "And after the trials?" Zeke asked. Coleman smiled. "After the trials, you're free to live your lives however you choose. Though I suspect Miss Mercer's testimony will make her something of a celebrity. Not everyone gets to bring down a territorial land fraud conspiracy." "I don't want to be a celebrity," Lila said firmly. "I want to be a rancher's wife in a small Colorado town, living quietly and raising children who understand the difference between right and wrong." "I think that can be arranged," Zeke said, squeezing her hand. As the day wore on and the immediate crisis was resolved, the cabin began to empty of officials and townspeople. Brennan and his remaining associates were transported to the territorial prison to await trial. Evidence was catalogued and secured for shipment to federal prosecutors. The normal rhythms of frontier life gradually reasserted themselves. But as sunset approached and they found themselves alone again, Lila and Zeke sat together on the porch in the rocking chair that had become a symbol of permanence in an uncertain world. She wore his mother's ring, and he held her father's pocket watch too, family heirlooms that represented the joining of their lives and histories. "Do you think Papa would approve?" she asked, looking at the watch that had contained his final gift to her. "I think your father spent his last days trying to make amends for his mistakes," Zeke replied. "I think he'd be proud of the woman you've become and the courage you've shown." In the distance, lights were beginning to flicker on in Millbrook, each one representing a family, a life, a story of people making their way in a challenging world. Some of those families would be getting their farms back because of the evidence Lila had found. Some would see justice served for wrongs they'd suffered. All of them would sleep safer tonight because Thomas Brennan's reign of terror was over. "When should we get married?" Lila asked, settling more comfortably against Zeke's chest. "Tomorrow, if you want," he replied. "Though Mrs. Henderson might never forgive us if we don't give her time to plan a proper celebration." "Next month, then," Lila decided. "After the first round of trials, I want to start our marriage with a clean slate, all debts paid, all accounts settled. All ghosts laid to rest?" "All ghosts laid to rest," she agreed. As the stars came out overhead and the first coyotes began their evening song, Lila Jane Mercer soon, to be Lila Jane Holt, felt the deep contentment of a woman who'd finally found her place in the world. The rocking chair creaked gently beneath them, a sound of home and peace and the promise of many evenings just like this one. The fight was over. The future was beginning. 6 months after Thomas Brennan's arrest, the autumn light filtering through the windows of the Millbrook courthouse cast warm patterns across the new house deed that lay spread on the judge's desk. Lila Holt, the name still sent a thrill of joy through her heart every time she heard it trace the property boundaries with her finger, marveling at how much their world had expanded since that desperate morning when she'd collapsed from hunger outside Harper's trading post. 500 acres, Judge Matthews said with satisfaction, stamping the official seal onto the document, including mineral rights, water access, and timber harvesting privileges. The federal land restitution program has been quite generous in this case. Zeke squeezed her hand as they accepted the deed to their new property land that had been stolen from a farming family by Brennan's conspiracy, and was now being granted to them as compensation for their role in bringing the criminals to justice. It wasn't just property they were receiving, it was the foundation for a future neither of them had dared to imagine during those dark days of pursuit and confrontation. "Thank you, Your Honor," Lila said, carefully folding the precious document. "We'll make good use of it." "I have no doubt you will," Matthews replied with a smile. "The territorial government owes you both a considerable debt. Your testimony has helped convict 23 federal criminals and recover over $2 million in stolen assets." The trials had been a grueling experience, requiring Lila to relive her father's involvement in the conspiracy over and over again. But each time she'd taken the witness stand, she'd thought about the families who'd lost their homes, the children who'd gone hungry because of Brennan's greed, and she'd found the strength to tell the truth completely and without reservation. Thomas Brennan himself had been sentenced to life in federal prison, his empire of corruption dismantled piece by piece. The territorial judges who'd taken his bribes had been removed from office and faced their own criminal charges. The railroad executives who'd orchestrated the land fraud scheme were paying massive fines and serving lengthy prison sentences. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the stolen land was being returned to its rightful owners, and new protections were being put in place to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. "Mrs. Holt," Judge Matthews continued, "there's one more matter we need to discuss. The territorial legislature has passed a resolution officially pardoning your father for his crimes in recognition of his final efforts to expose the conspiracy. His name has been cleared in the public record." The words hit Lila like a physical blow, not of pain, but of relief so profound it left her momentarily speechless. For months, she'd carried the weight of her father's complicated legacy, understanding his crimes while treasuring his final attempt at redemption. To have his courage officially recognized, his memory restored to honor, felt like the closing of a circle that had begun with his hidden confession. "Thank you," she whispered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "That means everything to me." As they left the courthouse, deed in hand and hearts full of gratitude, Lila and Zeke found themselves walking through a Millbrook transformed by prosperity and hope. The federal investigation had brought new businesses to town, drawn by the promise of honest government and fair dealing. The general store had expanded, a new school was under construction, and Doc Morrison had built a proper medical clinic to serve the growing population. But the most significant change was in the people themselves. The conspiracy's exposure had created a sense of community pride and civic engagement that hadn't existed before. Citizens who'd once felt powerless against corrupt officials now participated actively in local government, ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. "Look at this place," Zeke marveled as they passed the site where a new church was being built. 6 months ago, half these people were ready to give up and move somewhere else. Now they're planning for the next generation. "That's what justice does," Lila replied, thinking of the families who'd been reunited with their stolen property, the children who now had secure futures, the elderly folks who could live out their remaining years with dignity intact. "It gives people hope again." They made their way to the small cemetery on the hill above town, where fresh flowers marked the graves of Zeke's family. Lila knelt to place a bouquet of wildflowers beside the wooden cross he'd carved, then stood quietly while her husband paid his respects to the wife and children who'd shaped the man she'd fallen in love with. "Sarah," he said softly, "I found her, the woman you would have wanted me to find. I think you'd like her. She's brave and kind and stubborn enough to keep me honest." The wind rustled through the grass around the graves, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of children playing in the town below. It was a peaceful sound, full of promise and the simple joy of safety. "They would have loved you," Zeke said as they walked back down the hill. Sarah, especially. She always said that the measure of a person wasn't in their mistakes, but in what they chose to do after they recognized those mistakes. "Your father too," Lila replied, thinking of the man whose complex legacy had brought them together. "For all his faults, he chose courage in the end. That has to count for something." As they reached their own property, their new property, with its vast acreage and unlimited potential, they found evidence of the community support that had sustained them through the darkest days of their ordeal. A barn raising was in progress, with dozens of neighbors working together to construct the building where they'd house the cattle and horses that would form the foundation of their ranch. Mrs. Henderson was organizing food for the workers, while Doc Morrison supervised the raising of the heavy beam supports with the authority of a man who'd built his share of structures over the years. Sheriff Hawkins was there with his sons, along with the blacksmith, the preacher, and families from throughout the valley. "Looks like we're not doing this alone," Lila observed with a smile. "Never have been," Zeke replied. "That was Brennan's mistake, thinking that fear could replace the bonds between decent people. He never understood that the more pressure you put on a community, the stronger those bonds become." As they joined the barn raising, working alongside neighbors who'd become family, Lila felt the deep satisfaction of labor shared and burdens lightened by fellowship. This was what she'd been searching for, without knowing it, during all those months of wandering, not just a place to belong, but people to belong with. The day was fading toward evening, when the last beam was set and the completed barn stood solid and ready for use. As the volunteers began packing up their tools and preparing to head home, Mrs. Henderson approached with a basket covered by a checkered cloth. "Wedding gift," she said with a conspiratorial smile. "Thought you might want something special for your first dinner in your new home." Under the cloth was a complete meal roast chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden, and a small cake decorated with wildflowers. It was the kind of thoughtful gesture that transformed a house into a home, strangers into family. "Thank you," Lila said, embracing the older woman. "For everything, for standing with us when things looked hopeless." "Honey," Mrs. Henderson replied, "in a place like this, we all stand together or we all fall apart. You and Zeke reminded us of that when we needed it most." As their neighbors departed and the sun set behind the mountains, Lila and Zeke sat on the porch of their new house, a modest structure they'd built themselves with help from friends, and shared their first meal as property owners. The deed lay on the table between them, its official seals gleaming in the lamplight. "What do you think we should call this place?" Zeke asked, cutting slices from Mrs. Henderson's cake. "Hope Ranch," Lila said without hesitation. "Because that's what it represents, hope for families who lost everything, hope for justice delayed but not denied, hope for people like us who thought they'd never find home again." "Hope Ranch," he agreed, raising his coffee cup in a toast. To new beginnings and old values. To love that's stronger than fear, she replied, clinking her cup against his. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the sounds of their own land cattle settling for the night, the rustle of wind through their own trees, the distant call of an owl beginning its evening hunt, Lila reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd come to Millbrook with nothing but a threadbare satchel and the weight of her father's mistakes. She'd found a man who saw past her desperation to the strength beneath, a community that chose courage over comfort, and a future that proved redemption was possible for anyone willing to fight for it. The woman who'd collapsed from hunger and fear was gone, replaced by someone who understood that home wasn't a place you found, but a life you built with people who chose to stand beside you when the storms came. As Zeke's hand found hers in the darkness, and the first stars began to appear overhead, Lila Jane Holt smiled at the thought of all the tomorrows stretching ahead of them. There would be challenges. Certain ranch life was never easy, and the scars of their ordeal would take time to fully heal. But they would face those challenges together, on land that was truly theirs, surrounded by a community that had proven its worth in fire and adversity. The rocking chair from Zeke's cabin sat on their new porch, a symbol of permanence and patient love. The silver locket containing his grandparents' photograph rested against her heart, a promise kept and a future embraced. And somewhere in the house behind them, carefully preserved in a place of honor, her father's pocket watch ticked steadily onward, not just marking time, but measuring the distance between past mistakes and present redemption, between loss and recovery, between despair and hope. The story that had begun with collapse and desperation had found its ending in love and justice, and the kind of deep contentment that comes only to those who've learned that the greatest courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to build something beautiful in spite of it. Home, at last.